Hello and welcome to this video. My name's Beckham. I've noticed that many amateur photographers seem to have a love-hate relationship with whatever software they are using to manipulate their images. Many who I've spoken to seem to treat image editing a little bit like they're going into battle. They have a reluctance to go there. Now perhaps this is because on some occasions they use the sliders within their software to fix one problem, but then they cause two others that seem even harder to deal with than the first, or in fact in some cases impossible to deal with. In tricky lighting conditions we have to get the exposure right so that when we move those sliders we don't cause more problems than we're trying to solve. Now I've talked quite a bit about exposure over the years, and I've always suggested that we should squeeze as much light into the sensor as we possibly can. But of course this technique is now more commonly called exposure to the right. Let me try to show you the difference between two images shot at the same time. One was exposed as the camera would have it, and one exposed to the right. What I've done here is to put both of these images into a layered stack so we can view them one at a time on top of one another. I'm going to start by picking up my zoom, right clicking, and I'm going to go to 200%. In fact, I'll click again and move the image up to 300%. And what I want to do is to come down to an area of shadow so we can see a bit of shadow and a bit of the sky. Now what we're looking at here is the image that was exposed to the right. This is the image where the camera felt the exposure was correct. Both of the images were shot in aperture priority, but the previous image that I'll click back to now, this one had 2 stops more light squeezed into the sensor. So when we start to do our image editing, I'm largely editing from lighter pixels towards darkness here, but in this shot I'm having to do the opposite. I'm having to raise a little bit of detail from the shadows, and you can see the result in those shadows in the trees and also in the sky. So in Photoshop's layers we've just clicked back to the image which was exposed to the right, given 2 more stops of exposure than the camera wished to give. Let me just jump between the two quickly so you can see the difference. There's the correct exposure from the camera's point of view. Look at the difference when we expose to the right and do our editing from there. Now you can imagine trying to bring out the detail from this shot is going to be extremely tricky. Here it's a lot easier. Let's take a look. So here I have the 2 images in question opened up in Photoshop's bridge. This is the image that was exposed as the camera wished it to be exposed, and the important details are up on the left hand side. ISO was set at the lowest setting, 100, 60th of a second at f8. Here's the image that was exposed to the right, a 15th of a second at f8, and there we can see evidence that we've got 2 more stops of exposure squeezed into this shot. Now if we were looking at both of these as thumbnails, as we are here, and maybe on the back of the camera, this one may have more instant appeal, but this is the problem. The shadows here are harsh. If we're going to raise any detail at all, we're going to raise noise within the image, which I've just demonstrated. Here we can go the other way. So what I'm going to do is to start with this image, and I'm going to do a very quick manipulation through Camera Raw. With the image opened up in Adobe Camera Raw, I've got the clipping warning turned on at the top right of the basic screen, and you can see just a little bit of red here which indicates 1 or 2 pixels are burnt out. I don't worry about those small areas at all, because in actual fact what that tells me is I've squeezed as much light into the sensor here as I can possibly get away with. If I'd given any more exposure, well, we start to lose detail in more serious places. But in those tiny little places there, they are insignificant. But if you look carefully into the shadows, you can see the shadows look pretty good. I'm going to do a quick manipulation of both of these, and I'm going to do much the same for both, or try to get them to the same sort of density. So I'm going to start with chromatic aberration and profile corrections back to the basic tab. Going to give a little bit of clarity, not too much, a little bit of vibrance, but I've got a bit of blue in the shadows, natural for that time of day. So I'm going to set my white balance back to a nice warm tone that I remember, but I've got a bit of detail here and I can now deal with that sky. Looking at the histogram, that doesn't look too bad. I don't particularly need any blacks here. I could probably drop down some of the highlights a little bit. I could bring down a graduated filter and I can start to give a little bit of manipulation to that, maybe to enhance the image, and maybe even one at the bottom, perhaps not quite so strong, but you get the idea. We've still got some detail here, a little bit of burnout here still, but not that much. I'm going to go back to my basic tab, drop those highlights down a little more. Let's turn that off. You can see they're insignificant, and I'm going to open this up into Photoshop. Now with that instant change, I've opened up the original image, the one which was exposed correctly from the camera's point of view, and we can see evidence of that above, just underneath the histogram, f8 at 1/60th of a second. Just before I opened up the previous image, I did save a preset, so I'm just going to go to my presets here, and I called it test image. So I'm going to apply exactly the same changes that I applied to the previous one, but of course they're not going to be quite right, because I don't want here to drop the shadows or drop the exposure. What I want to do is to just lift them a little bit, just so I've got a bit of detail here. I've got a bit of clarity the same, the vibrance is the same, although because it's darker we may not need quite as much. And we certainly don't need a graduated filter to darken the sky, but of course that's going to be offset by the amount of noise we're likely to have here. Now I think that's more or less the same, so I'm going to open this up into Photoshop and we can quickly compare the two. So here we have those two quickly edited raw files open in Photoshop and placed into a layered stack, so I can turn them on and off and we can compare the two. The one we're viewing at the moment was the one that was exposed correctly from the camera's point of view. The one below has been exposed plus 2 stops. When I turn them on and off, you can see a little bit of difference in the middle ground here, but I could certainly darken the water there and add colour in camera raw of the lighter of the two. But I think for a comparison, I think we're okay to go. So what I'm going to do here is pick up my zoom. We'll zoom into a spot that we can see clearly. There we go. Let's bring this way up to about 300%. There we can see the noise in the sky. In fact, we'll come up one more, I think. There we can see the effect of the image exposed correctly. There's our exposure to the right. A significant difference, and I think a pretty good example of why getting that exposure right is so vital for good manipulation and quality images. So when we're shooting images, particularly at dawn and dusk, and particularly in contrasty situations like this, quite often what we see on the back of our camera, if it looks really good, quite often it may be a little bit troublesome. If you squeeze as much light into the sensor as you can, when you see the image on the back of the camera, it can quite often look very insipid and pale. But as long as you've not overdone that overexposure, then your image editing is going to be quick and easy, because you're going from light pixels to dark, and when you do that you don't cause most of the problems that we have trouble dealing with. I think we need to keep in mind that when we shoot raw files, we're telling the camera to capture just raw computer data and do no in-camera editing at all. It's very much like we used to do back in our black and white film days, where the black and white negative was the starting point. Well, the raw file that we now shoot is also the starting point, so we shouldn't expect to see a perfect result in that raw file. If you can achieve that and get great exposure, then all power to you. But in most cases, exposed to the right, you'll improve your image quality, you'll speed up your editing process, and you'll learn more too. If you've enjoyed this video, can I invite you to come along to www.beckhamdigital.com.au. I make a comprehensive range of Photoshop training videos under the heading of Photoshop for Photographers, but I also make individual sets of videos on subjects like layers, shooting raw, creating effective selections, and more. I also have a comprehensive range of videos under the heading of Lightroom. Can I invite you to come along to the address you can see on screen and join our photographic forum. We have a number of topics, including Photoshop of course and image editing, along with audio-visual. Come along and join the forum where you can talk to me and others who share your interests.